I'm going to read chapter 3. In chapter 2, Abbas and his family had to sell everything. It was a very sad episode because him and his mother remembered the time that Abbas's father asked his mother to marry her. And they ended up selling everything in the house, even Mama June's bed. And at the end of the chapter, Abbas gave his father all of his money from the piggy bank, which he had to dig. So it was a very sad chapter. Page 33, chapter 3. A month of packing and planning, waiting and worrying rushed by. And then finally, the day we were to leave arrived. Baba, which is what he calls his dad, went out to change our money into dollars, and the house was quiet. He had left this until the last moment so that he could change all of the money at one time. Then he wouldn't have to pay the commission for exchanging it twice. Maman's bag, which is his mother, and mine had been packed the previous night and stood by the door. I was dressed and ready to go. My footsteps echoed against the walls as I walked through all the rooms, looking for Maman and Maman June. As I entered the kitchen, I saw the two of them sitting on the floor with a plate and some dried bread in front of them. My mother told me to sit next to them. Maman June, which is his grandmother, smiled. "Come over here, my darling. You should eat before leaving," she murmured. "It's going to be a long day." I peered. I looked at the plate. "What is it?" I asked. Page 34. My mother tried to smile. "It's only fried onions with lavash, Abbas," which is bread. She stopped to compose herself before continuing. "That's all we have left." Fried onions? Since when did we start eating that? But I was hungry and I could see that my mother was upset. So I sat down and took the smallest portion I could, putting the fried onions on a piece of the dry bread. My mother and Mama June watched with great interest. After taking a small bite, I chewed very carefully, expecting the worst. To my surprise, it wasn't half bad, so I helped myself to eat more. I hadn't known fried onions and bread could taste this good. "I knew you would like it," my mother said. "So did I responded. She just smiled. She always knew what I was thinking. While Mama June was clearing the plates, the door opened. It was my father, and he had a tight smile on his face. "Time to go," he said. "Say goodbye to Maman June, Abbas." I walked over to Maman June and stood in front of her. She held my cheeks with both of her hands and kissed me. "I'll miss you, my darling. You take good care of yourself, and always remember that you are a Kazaruni. I've prayed for you, and I will continue to pray for you." "Goodbye, Mama June," I said, and then I began to sob. "Come on now, Abbas. Men don't cry, you know that," she said with a gentle smile. "You're a Kazaruni, remember?" She tidied my hair and took my hand. "Be strong, my boy. Be strong." I tried to stop crying and waited for my mother to say goodbye to Maman June. My grandmother, Maman June, hugged my mother tightly and whispered in her ear, "You're doing the right thing, my girl." "Goodbye, Maman," my mother replied with tears in her eyes. Before I knew it, the three of us were in the car that my father had borrowed. As my father pulled away, I looked at each of the houses on our street. So many memories flashed before my eyes. All of my soccer games, the times I had ripped my trousers, the fights I had been in. I remembered how my friends Ali, Sora, Mehdi, and Farad, the boys I played with on the streets, would come to my house and ask my mother if I could play. I remembered the bike rides, the games, the trouble and mischief we got into together, and the fun we had. The car was going faster as we moved onto the main streets and eventually onto the motorway. No one had spoken since we had left. My mother and I were trying hard not to cry. Baba drove in auto cruise. I could see his brain ticking as he tried to think of some last-minute advice to give to us. He seemed desperate to keep calm. Out of the blue, he asked, What's the capital of Turkey, Abbas? I thought for a minute and then guessed. Istanbul. My father gave my mother an amused look. Maman turned around and looked at me with a smile. I sighed with relief as I thought I had got it right. Then my mother said, "It's Ankara, page 36. But it's a common mistake to make, as she jokingly slapped my father on the shoulder. He's just trying to trick you. That little incident was enough to take our minds away from the reality of the day, even just for a few minutes. That is all I remember of the rest of the journey. I cannot remember the roads, what I saw, or what was said apart from that conversation. I know, however, that I looked out of the window for most of the ride, hoping it would never end. The longer it went on, the more hope I had that we would never arrive at Tehran airport. Remember, Tehran is where they live. But then my father pulled up to the terminal. There was a deadly silence in the car. I could hear my mother breathing deeply, trying to control herself. My father sat staring through the windshield at the wall in front of him. I could hear him reaching for his worry beads in his left trouser pocket. Only about 20 seconds ticked past, but it felt like hours. Each of us was alone in that moment, and yet together one last time as a family. My father snapped us out of our revive. "Come on, we've got to get you checked in." I got out of the car slowly and went around to the trunk, so to the back of the car where my parents stood. My father pulled our 2 suitcases while I reached in to get the smaller bags from the back seat. He looked at us, then picked up my bag and started to walk. My mother tried to carry her own bag, but I stopped her. "I'll take it, Maman." "It's heavy," she said. "I'll manage," I insisted. She began to walk alongside my father, and I hobbled behind them, struggling with the heavy suitcase. My father went through the main entrance where thousands of people were sitting, eating, talking, and lining up. It's a busy airport. He stopped for a moment to look at a screen and then turned to my mother. "What's the flight number again?" "IR391, I cut in. My mother nodded to confirm. I could see that my quickness had put a smile on my father's face. All of a sudden, he had a spring in his step. He looked at the screen again and then began to lead us to a check-in desk about 50 yards away. Once again, I struggled behind with the suitcase. About 20 feet from the desk, my father stopped. He waited for me to catch up, took Maman's bag from me, and knelt down to my level. "Abbas, you go over and sit on the seat," he said gently, "and save the next 2 seats for you, Maman, and me. We'll go check in." "Okay, Baba," I said, and I did as I was told. I was getting nervous. Would we be able to get on that flight? I watched as they joined the line. There were about 4 or 5 people ahead of them. My father leaned toward my mother and whispered something. My mother quickly checked her headscarf to make sure that her hair was not showing. This is a headscarf here. My mother, at home, she never bothered with the scarf, but in public it was compulsory. So it was the law that all women have to cover their hair and faces, like this. She often pushed the strict rules about dress to their limits, but this was not a good time or place to do that. I think my father was telling her this. Page 38. As the line moved forward, my parents looked as if they were chatting casually. Everything seemed to be running according to plan. I turned to scan the room. There were huge posters of Ayatollah Khomeini all over the airport. There were armed soldiers everywhere, some no older than 16 or 17. I watched people saying their goodbyes. Just here is the picture of the new leader. Remember the Ayatollahs? The ones that came in? I hadn't thought I'd taken my attention away from my parents for more than 30 seconds, but I obviously had, because as I looked back towards the check-in desk, I noticed they were at the head of the line. At first it all seemed normal, but then I saw that everything was not fine. My father and the man behind the desk were arguing. Baba looked shocked and angry. Both men kept looking at my mother. It was getting ugly when suddenly Baba stopped talking. Remember, Baba is his father. He put his hand out in acceptance of the situation and pulled my mother with him. She looked shaken. I wanted to go over and see what was happening, but I thought better of it. I saw my father say something to my mother. She listened, looking more and more horrified with each word Baba spoke. Then she began to talk. In fact, she was almost shouting when my father shrieked for her to shut up. The entire terminal, everyone turned to see what was going on. My father whispered something to her and pointed to 2 seats, but not the ones near me. My mother was sobbing. She was crying as she walked towards them. I got up and started to walk over to my mother, but then I noticed my father staring at me. I stopped dead. He quietly motioned me to go back to my seat. I did what he wanted, but I could not take my eyes off my mother. She wouldn't look at me. I noticed my father walk briskly to the other side of the terminal until he reached a phone at the far end. He searched his pockets for some change and his phone book. I was half watching him and half keeping an eye on my mother in case she made eye contact with me. She was hysterical, crying and crying. I had never seen her like this before. My father looked around anxiously as he dialed a number and waited for a response. I could see he was desperate and trying hard not to show it. His eyes were looking over the terminal, making sure no one was watching him or listening. Then he looked at me, and I knew he was talking about me. He finished his conversation, slowly putting the phone down, and walked back towards me. Every step deliberate, as if he was trying to buy some more time to think his plan through. He sat next to me. He did not say anything. He sat there like a stranger. After crossing his legs, he got out his beads and sighed. I was too scared to say anything. Then he turned to me. "They won't let your mother out," he said very calmly. "What? Why is that?" I asked. "Some technical issue. It's all rubbish," he said casually, as if talking to a friend about some small annoying thing. "It's just a trick to try and keep you here." "Oh," I said confused. "So are we going home?" "Well," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "I've been thinking. They're saying that they won't let your mother out, but they're not saying that they won't let you out." Page 40. "So? Well, that means you can still go, Abbas." "What? Alone?" I asked. He must be joking. Remember, Abbas is only 9 years old. "If you stay, you will probably go to war," he said. "I'm not saying you will die, but it's a strong possibility. However, if you go to Turkey, you'll have a chance at a life that I can't give you here in Iran. And obviously, if it doesn't work out, you can come back. There will be no shame in that. At least you will have tried." He meant what he said, and while he was giving me the option to choose, in Persian culture, which is where they're from, they're Persian people, when your father gives you that kind of choice, you say yes. I had to go. I just nodded. I didn't have the strength to say yes out loud. "Good lad," he said. "You're a Kazaruni through and through." I smiled in order to stop myself from crying. "Right," he said. "Because you're not even 10 years old, you can't just get on a plane with no one to greet you at the other end. That's why I made that call. I have a friend in Istanbul who will pick you up, pretending to be your uncle, Farad. I won't tell you his real name. It's better that way. How will I recognize him? I asked. Good question, he said. He will have a large card with your name on it. He'll say that he wrote it for the benefit of the flight attendant. Okay, so he'll pick me up for sure? Yes. When you see him, run up to him as if you know him really well and give him a kiss, he instructed. Then what? He will take care of you. He owes me a favor from way back. He reached inside his jacket pocket and took out an envelope. He held it as he put it in my hands. Inside this envelope, Abbas, he said, are 1,701 US dollars. Everything we have sold over the last month is here. He paused. Look after it with your life, and it can give you a start not every child in this country gets. I will, Baba, I said, still trying not to cry. I promise. Good boy, he said with a tender smile. I'm very proud of you. You're very brave. Now sit here for a second while I try to check you in. I watched him go over to the desk, which now had no line at all. This time he had no problem, but I could see that the man behind the desk was surprised as well as annoyed, because my clever father had trapped him in a loophole. It was so like my father to want to have the last word, and this time he did. He returned with a smile on his face, but as he reached me, he became serious again. Remember all that I have taught you, he said. Always think before you do or say anything. Yes, Baba. And call me as soon as you reach Istanbul, okay? I will. Page 42. Now is the time that you have to be a man, my son, he said. Go and say goodbye to your mother, but please do not cry, as she is already very upset. Okay, I said, trying to hold back all my feelings. This was no ordinary goodbye. My mother was the person I loved the most in this world. I walked over to where she sat, crying. I have to go now, Maman, I said. I stood next to her stiffly, my eyes filled with tears, and all I was thinking about was trying to stop them from rolling down my cheeks. Goodbye, Maman. My mother held me so tightly that I could barely breathe. She was weeping, crying, and I felt guilty for not showing my feelings. Goodbye, my darling, she said. I love you so much. I love you more than anything in this world, Abbas. You know that, right? I just nodded. I'm so sorry you're going alone, but I promise to join you as soon as I can. I'll try to be there for your birthday in a week. Come on, Abs, we've got to get you through the gate, my father said from the distance. Now you look after yourself, were my mother's last words. As I walked away from her, I saw her fall to her knees, crying uncontrollably, inconsolably. At the gate, when the flight attendant was about to take me away, my father offered his hand for me to shake. His grip, his handshake, was very strong and firm. He held my hand in his while he said, Good luck, son, and then have a good trip. I couldn't bear to look back as I walked away from the gate, tears rolling down my face. I cannot remember very much about that flight. I sat in the seat and stared out of the window, hoping I would get one last look at my parents before taking off. Then I cried myself to sleep even before the plane took off. Before I knew it, I was landing in Istanbul, where it was already night. I waited until the flight attendant came to get me. I don't remember about what we talked about on our short walk to the arrivals lounge, but I know that I only gave her yes and no answers. I was more worried about seeing my name on the card and acting in a way that wouldn't give the game away. Remember, he's arrived in Istanbul, in Turkey, without his family, and he has to pretend that he knows this man. We had cut ahead of all of the lines, and suddenly we were at the lounge. My eyes were working overtime, looking everywhere. In a panic, I saw that there were many signs with many different names. Then, in the back, I saw a tall man with a dark beard and a moustache who was obviously Iranian. He's from Iran, just like Abbas. He was wearing a black shirt and black trousers and had sunglasses on, even though it was night. As soon as I saw him holding up my name, I made a dash for him. I ran. I think he was surprised when I jumped up and hugged him and gave him the 2 traditional Iranian kisses, saying, "Hey, Uncle Farad, how are you?" Page 44. Before he could reply, the flight attendant appeared with the documents and papers. "Farad Kazaruni?" she asked with a smile. "That's me," he responded with a fake smile. He took the papers from her and signed them, then watched her leave. Eventually, he noticed me looking up at him, waiting for instructions. "Go and swap $20 at the foreign exchange office," he said, which is where you change money. "But my father said that I should swap money on the black market because I'll get more money, a better rate," I said hesitatingly. "Did he now?" the man said with an arrogant smile. "Well, he's right. But what exactly does he expect you to use to pay for the taxi?" As I walked to the foreign exchange office, I was thinking about what he had said. Why would I need a taxi now that Maman wasn't with me as planned? Hadn't Baba said this man would look after me? I didn't want to argue though, so I put $20 on the counter and the lady gave me the equivalent amount in Turkish lira, which is the money. I walked slowly back to the man and waited to see what he would do next. "Right. Here's a list of the cheapest hotels in Istanbul that you'll be safe at," he said. "Only Iranians, so people from Iran, like Abbas, stay at these hotels, and everyone speaks Farsi. Farsi is the language they use in Iran. In Turkey, they use Turkish. The taxi line is over there. Now my number is at the bottom of the piece of paper, but do not call it. I repeat, do not call it unless it's a matter of life and death. Do you understand?" "Yes," I replied. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Good, well, off you go then," he said with another fake smile. "But my father said that you'd look after me." "Your father said many things. I don't have time to stay here and entertain you," he snapped. "Now, if you won't go, I will." The man walked off into the crowd, and before I knew it, he had disappeared. There I was with my suitcase in the middle of Istanbul airport, alone. I didn't even realize I was crying until I saw the tears hit my shoes. Outside it was dark. Night. I was 9 years old and by myself in a foreign land. I didn't even speak the language. Quite simply, I was terrified. It's the end of